Okay, this week we're starting to study early contacts between Native American people and colonists. We looked at Christopher Columbus, and now we're going to start to really dive into these relationships that were developing between Native peoples and the British, the French, and the Spanish. So we're going to kind of answer this week. This is our overall essential question: how did geography shape colonial America? Our theme, we're going to be kind of looking at this through environment and geography, but also migration and movement of peoples. And trying to get the slide to go. Here we go, here we go. Slide to go. There we go. So, for many Americans, the traditional imagery of pre-Columbian North America is one of a small or medium-sized native tribes living in vast primeval forests or on rolling plains, largely unaltered by human hands, sort of this pristine wilderness area. And that's kind of some mythology in American history that has occurred. What you see in this map here are the vast variety of Native American tribes that inhabited North America and Central America. And they did not share common languages, common culture. And while it is a vast continent, there were lots of places that were very densely populated and very advanced in their societies. So where did this myth come from? Well, Europeans perpetuated this myth early, partly because as they mapped coastlines in the 1500s, you get the east coast of the United States, what becomes the United States, and the west coast. You have all this space that just sort of doesn't exist on the map, and so it's assumed that it's empty. There's no firm count due to a lack of written records of how many Native Americans actually lived on the continents, but estimates of pre-Columbian Native populations in the Americas range between 20 and 100 million. So that's a big swing, but the consensus estimate of historians is somewhere between 40 and 80 million. And people suggest that approximately, what are we looking at? 3.8 million of those were in North America. He estimates that by 1650, only 5.6 million people, native peoples, remained in North, Central, and South America. And that is because of the diseases that were brought by Europeans and spread rapidly through the native populations. However, there's physical evidence and other archaeological evidence that indicates that pre-Columbian population of North America was much larger and more advanced than popular myth has taught. As a result, the land in a lot of regions was far from pristine, and they had left their mark on these places. Native tribes engaged in large-scale agriculture, irrigation. The Aztecs were very sophisticated with their irrigation. They built towns, roads for trade, temples, and conducted far-ranging commerce. Vast areas of forest were regularly burned to create and maintain fields and prairies for archaeological use. Terraced farming was used in the Andes Mountains. Thriving civilizations were found across the continent of North America, yet by the time settlers arrived in significant numbers in the late 1600s, early 1700s, lots of tribes had vanished or were vastly reduced in number and power through disease and warfare. Native settlements and agricultural efforts had largely vanished over perhaps centuries of neglect. So an example of this would be Cahokia. At its peak, archaeologists estimate that it had as many as 40,000 people living in this city. It was the largest settlement north of the Rio Grande until the 1800s. And if you think about North America up until 1800, the largest city in America up until 1800 was Philadelphia, and it only had 23,000 people. So this is a pretty big, sophisticated city. You also had the Pueblo and the Anasazi Indians down in Chaco Canyon. Between 5,000 and 15,000 people lived in Chaco Canyon at its peak at around 1100 AD. And this is the archaeological ruins of Pueblo Bonita, which was a place that housed more than 1,000 residents, essentially under one roof. You see large common areas, storage for grain, and then basically apartments that everybody lived in. And not until New York City in the 19th century do we start to see those sorts of habitats for humans. I attended and went to Mesa Verde this summer, and that's where the cliff dwellers were. And again, very innovative, very creative ways of living up on the cliffs and building their homes in the cliffs. So why did people assume that the continent was sparsely populated? How did this myth perpetuate? Well, part of it is the absence of major settlements and large tribes that to convince many people in the 19th century, the 1800s. Many 19th century scholars and settlers on the continent believed that it had been largely empty prior to the arrival of European explorers. They also seem to have been unaware of first-person accounts that were written by earlier explorers such as Hernando de Soto, as well as letters and diaries kept by early colonists who described the size and complexity of native societies they encountered. So this myth was perpetuated by historians who were writing about this time period in the 1800s. So here's some example of quotes from those early explorers and New England colonists. It looked as if God had placed all of our greater part of the entire human race in these countries. That was 1542. By 1602, I've traveled more than 800 leagues along the coast and kept a record of all the people I encountered, and the coast is populated by an endless number of Indians. And number 3, a New England colonist by the 1630s, and the bones and skulls upon several places of their habitations made such a spectacle that the Massachusetts woodlands, heavily urbanized populations were wiped out. So over the course of 100 years, you can see right here, these populations existed, and you see the effects of Europeans bringing diseases such as smallpox. Even though some of these native populations had never actually come face to face with white Europeans, they were definitely feeling the effects of those white Europeans on these continents through the spread of disease. Lots of explorers and the French developed relationships with these native populations. Samuel de Champlain explored and found Quebec City and explored the St. Lawrence Seaway. This is a map that he published in a journal of his explorations, and in 1613 he essentially had this fold-out map with the idea, and this was called New France, the idea of attracting people to come and stay here. So if you notice, here you have very nice Native Americans. Below that you see food and fauna. That would be edible plants and flora. You see the major waterways, which are the Great Lakes. And this was all meant to attract colonists to the area. If you drew natives scary, people would not want to come. Champlain's early alliances with the Huron and Algonquin tribes against the Iroquois Confederacy, who they were warring with, really stop. Okay, interruptions. My in-laws are calling on my computer. Okay, Champlain's earliest alliances with these Huron and Algonquin tribes led to a very vibrant fur trade and trapping trade that happened in Canada and what became the northern United States. They took sides in wars between tribes, and in this case they sided against the Iroquois, and that dominated French policies in North America for a century, so from the 1500s into the 1600s. The English also had colonies in the Americas. This painting was done in the 1700s, representing a treaty that occurred in 1681 between William Penn and the local tribes in Pennsylvania. William Penn was a Quaker, and he was given a charter in 1881 to establish a colony in the United States. Later, he traveled and negotiated a peace with the existing natives, and this great treaty of 1682-83 was said to have taken place under this large leafy tree. Lots of Native Americans engaged in treaties with these Europeans, and they signed them. They were formal agreements between governments and their representatives. They used their clan symbols as totems, which identified them as the signers, and often signed for much broader tribal groups. The problem with that was that it sometimes created conflict within tribes. If one clan member and a clan is essentially a family within a tribe, you know, went and signed a treaty with say the British or the Dutch, but other clans within that tribe disagreed with that treaty, and so that often caused strife within those tribes as well. So this is actually a deed of trust from Native American tribes in what is now northern New York. And this document was showing that natives had entered into a treaty and granted ownership to the King of England, ownership of what is now present-day Ohio and New York. Actually, this was given to the Indians. Later, they swapped, and the Indians sold it to the King of England. So there's another document that shows that they ceded it over to the King of England. Initially, this first treaty, before they signed over their property, just allowed for hunting rights, etc. All right, so here you have some views. This is an illustration that was created in 1785, and so you can see one of our things that we're trying to look at are continuities and changes of these relationships between natives over time. How did they stay the same? How did they change and evolve? So knowing that this was created in 1883 rather, this woodcut depicting of an event that actually occurred in 1785, does the fact that the image was printed 100 years later after the event matter? If so, what changed? Why would people's views about Native Americans have changed over time? Well, one, Europeans lived in a finite amount of space in Europe. As of the Middle Ages, the feudal system was well entrenched, and you had to be part of the aristocracy to own land. So if you wanted to own land, and you weren't an aristocrat, it was very difficult to come by. You had to either inherit it, or for some reason somebody had to randomly be selling it. And so that's why millions of people started coming to what they thought was an empty continent to begin farming. Land equaled wealth in this time period. And so Europeans had this insatiable appetite. Land was a finite resource. They kept pushing further and further, clearing off land and chasing off game. And as that happens into the late 1600s, into the 1700s, tensions rise and conflicts occur between these native tribes and these whites who are now on the frontiers, and coming into contact and breaking treaties that had been created with these Native Americans. So that is how ideas about natives begin to shift, taking them from these noble savages that we need to convert and have positive relationships with to just brutal savages that we need to push off their land. And eventually the policy is such, by the time we get to Andrew Jackson, we are forcibly removing Native Americans from their land so that we can put farmers, American farmers, on their property. So Monday, we're going to start talking about the middle ground, early contacts between these people. And the questions we're going to look at are, how did Europeans initially view natives? I would say for the most part it was fairly positive. How did they forge relationships? They traded, especially the French were engaged in trading of fur and other fashion items that ladies in France particularly were in style and looking for. And then these relationships changed over time as Europeans continued to pour into the continent and push Native Americans off their land. More later.